This show will be Jim Malone's 5th at the Goldmark Gallery, but it also marks his last as an exhibiting potter as he looks to relocate to the remoter isles of northwest Scotland. The pots in this exhibition, therefore, are not just from the very last firing at Lesson Hall in Cumbria, which has been Jim's home for the last 20 years, but pieces spanning those 2 decades. What we're looking at in this exhibition is not just the most recent creative exploits of the last few years, but a legacy of potting of almost 50 years as a working potter, and of a life dedicated in the most fundamental way to his art. I hope you enjoy this last exhibition of Jim Malone's. Those many years of dedication, of commitment to his craft, have bred a kind of inevitability about Jim's pots. As I look out at this exhibition, I see there's a kind of generous repertoire of forms here. They're quite hearty pots. They've got substance to them. And they look almost as if they couldn't look any other way.
Jim, you began as a painter.
Well, I didn't.
I need to tell you that he didn't begin as a painter. What did he begin as?
Well, I went to do a foundation course at Cumbria in South London, and I imagined that I was going to become a painter. We were required to do something three-dimensional, and I opted to do sculpture because I thought I was going to be a, in inverted commas, fine artist. So then I spent the next 6 weeks making a plaster mould of a milk bottle. And in the end, I thought, this is just a waste of time, you know. So I went back to the head of foundation and said, look, I'm not prepared to do this anymore. It's a waste of time. And he said, well, why don't you have a crack at pottery then? I started doing 1 day a week pottery at Cumbria. And that's where I met Ian Godfrey. And then, of course, I read Bernard Leach's A Potter's Book, the first chapter, which is called Towards a Standard. And I actually found that I agreed with everything that he said. And then, of course, Ian took us as a group to the V&A to see all those old Korean and Chinese pots. And I didn't know anything about Sung Dynasty pottery or Korean pottery or who Bernard Leach was or Hamada. And I thought, well, you know, there's something here that I've been missing, you know, and that was it. I thought it's time I got into this. So that's how I became a potter.
Jim Malone has long worked with a kind of historical repertoire of forms, forms that look back to 12th, 13th century China, to the Sung Dynasty, to 15th, 16th, 17th century Korea, to medieval pots in this country, to German pots. And from this broad historical range, he has formed a kind of identity. He's put down roots and found a voice in potting that is at once immediately recognisable. Any one of these pots you could pick out immediately as one of Jim Malone's, but is also in a way kind of self-effacing. It's aiming at a higher purpose, a higher ideal aesthetic. But I think Jim is a more mercurial, a more spontaneous potter than we perhaps give him credit. It's the way he's able to combine forms and details from one era with another almost seamlessly that really marks him apart. I love the banding that he introduces, particularly to these taller, these larger pots that helps divide the large canvas of the pot itself. Sometimes a third of the way up, sometimes a half way up the pot. Ledges that help collect the ash glaze that pours down them. The pelleting that he takes from medieval ware and sometimes displaces to pots formed like this that you might expect from Sung Dynasty China. Picking and choosing, combining these little formalities, these little aesthetic choices, and combining them in a way that feels completely at ease, completely seamless. I think we see this also in the kind of emotional tenor of his pots. He can be quite severe and formal, almost hieratic in some of these tall vases, which are some of my favourite forms. I love this S-like combing, this straight line that comes and is carved through the surface of the clay with a tool of his own making. But then he can also be whimsical, he can be romantic and nostalgic, as in the leaning willow forms that he incises into some of his pots, or some of the beautiful calligraphic paintwork that he adorns some of these Hakame bottles. So although the pots of this exhibition are visibly of one voice, the more we look at the details, the surfaces of his pots, the combinations that he's making, there's actually an awful lot going on here. Some of the hallmarks that we see in the pots in this exhibition point to a kind of potting lineage, a kind of inheritance, a cultural inheritance that Jim has. You'll see on some of the Tomoku and the Nuka glazed pots in this exhibition little copper splashes and pours. That was a favourite technique of Bill Marshall's. They're particularly effective, I think, on the Tomoku bottles that like to break to this beautiful sort of rusty plum red colour. Malone's potting journey began more than 50 years ago at Camberwell School of Art, and there he had some fairly important inspirational tutors, people like Emmanuel Cooper. But crucially, during those 4 years, he spent 1 year away at Winchcombe Pottery, which was Michael Cardew's old workshop, then under the management of Ray Finch. And this was vital because it showed Jim not just the practical realities of running a workshop, of how to set up your working day, how to work with your materials, the kind of very close relationship you would have with all of the peripheral activities of making pots, the throwing, the glazing, the preparing of the kiln. More than that, I think it showed Jim the kind of pottery that he wanted to commit himself to, the kind of conditions that he was going to have to embrace to make the work that we see in this exhibition. One of his favourite quotes is a quote of Hamader's, talking about how there are essentially two different kinds of pots. There's the household plant pot, and then there's the pot like the old gnarled tree that grows on the mountainside, that has weathered the difficulties of that terrain. Hamader always aspired to the old tree on the mountainside, and Jim Malone saw that that was where he wanted to go too. He describes how he left the hothouse of London and has ever since worked pretty well on his own out in the countryside. Jim makes pots much as he talks about them. He often quotes from those past masters he most respects, and then finds a new significance, a freshness in their voice today. A particular favourite phrase of his is Michael Cardew's warning to the amateur potter looking to express themselves in clay, a warning against the deliberately willed injection of personality. It's a great phrase. It captures something sort of alien, eccentric, inauthentic and synthetic, none of the things that we find in Jim's pots. You look about this exhibition, there is no bravado, there's no machismo in this work, even in these sort of largest pots, things like this handsomely large dish here with this beautiful incised, engraved willow design. There is a kind of harmony to the work through this exhibition, and it's a harmony that's kind of reflected in the garden that Jim and his partner have cultivated in Cumbria. That idea of things growing together almost seamlessly in harmony. When we look at the pots in this exhibition, they're a little like a garden that have been grown in harmony. There are combinations of glazes, there's a kind of layering of glazes going on, whether it's granite and ash glazes, Nuka glazes dripping down the side of a pot, or whether it's the layering of slip, of glaze, of iron brushwork that we get in these Korean-inspired Hakame vases. Jim is a particularly strong thrower, but you don't need me to tell you that. You could pick up pretty well any pot in this exhibition and see the craftsmanship on display. He's particularly well known for his jugs, and there's a really beautiful medieval style, tall, quite proud, handsome, noble jug on the shelf just behind me over there. I also like his smaller jugs with a slightly narrower mouth. They've got this kind of lovely, sort of homely, almost like a little mother hen shape to them. But in particular in this exhibition, if you look around the pots around me, look at some of these taller vases, I think you see that Jim Malone is a potter who has always been strong in the vertical line. His pots have a kind of elevation to them. He's always worked from that principle, Bernard Leach's principle, that to throw on a wheel is essentially drawing a line in space. And he's particularly good, I think, when he's working with that line, the higher it becomes. Something like this beautiful pot, which is in a pretty tricky medium of porcelain, a notoriously tricksy clay to work with. And he's pulled off this tall, beautiful, elegant form beautifully. Throwing of this kind requires not just years of dedication, years of honing. It's a little more than that. There is a kind of minimal interruption in Jim's work, a kind of philosophy of sensitivity and of restraint. He's always worked with a kick wheel, a light sort of momentum kick wheel, and that has its own kind of gentle heartbeat, almost like a pulse every time it's kicked. What it also means is that every time you touch the clay and therefore slow that wheel down, and you have to get kicking again with your leg, you have to be incredibly purposeful about everything that you do. Every time you touch the clay has to have meaning. Jim very rarely trims his work, and so everything has a kind of freshness, a kind of quality that what has ended up on the shelves here in this exhibition has come pretty well exactly as it was intended from the wheel. It's that philosophy of restraint, that idea that you don't want to squeeze out the kind of natural quality, the character of the clay in front of you, that has sat at the heart of Jim's practice as almost 50 years now as a working potter. And I thought it'd be nice to end this exhibition walkthrough with some words of Jim's own. He's so often one to quote potters that he admires. It'd be nice to end with his own words. Because like Bernard Leach and Hamada, like Michael Cardew, like the pupils of that school, Jim has always known that the condition of simplicity that produces beautiful pottery like this in this exhibition is one of great difficulty, it's one of great solitude, of hard work. Something that he wrote a number of years ago that I'd like to quote here. "A potter's life is not easy," Jim writes. "The hours are long and often lonely, but when he's played his part well and the kiln has been kind, the good pot is a thing of lasting beauty, and as Bernard Leach once said, worth any sacrifice, even life itself. This holds true for me still, for this is not what I do, this is what I am." It's a really beautiful, heartfelt sentiment. It's words that Jim used to introduce his pottery to the Goldmark Gallery 15 years ago. And it seems only right that this last exhibition of his should close with them too. I hope you've enjoyed this exhibition walkthrough of Jim Malone's final exhibition.